briefly introduce the three of us. So I'm Christopher Vickert. Welcome, nice to see everyone. I'm an associate professor in ethics and sustainability at VU Amsterdam. Actually, I haven't been there. I have been there only once since March, and I'm now calling in from a town near Cologne in Germany. So I kind of missed that. You probably haven't seen your university for quite a while as well. And I'm also an associate editor at the Journal of Management Studies. And what I'll talk about today is, well, impactful research, and basically, well, discussing that from the position of a bit of the journal and from my role as an editor of the journal. Katharina.
Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Katharina. I'm an associate professor in the Organization Studies and HRM group at Warwick Business School in the UK. We're located close to Coventry. I've been at Warwick for 2 years now, and I recently, in March this year, I won a pretty big grant. I was lucky enough to win a grant to study a grand challenge in more detail. And that's what I'm going to talk about, basically my journey of how I got started to work on grand challenges, and maybe some lessons learned that might be helpful and interesting for you to build on. And then over to Ali.
Yes, yeah, good afternoon, good morning, good night to everyone. Greetings from Hamburg. Yeah, so I'm based at the University of Hamburg as a researcher, and I see also some of my colleagues have joined. So we really care about grand challenges sustainability. If you want to look up some of them, Iris Seidemann, Lisa Harbert, Franziska, Annalena, scholars who all work on issues like sustainability, emergency situations in Uganda and elsewhere. So a lot of us here really well, I guess, do work at the intersection of business and society. I'm also head of research group at the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society in Berlin, which is a 2-hour train ride from Hamburg, where I lead a research group of 20 scholars working at the intersection of entrepreneurship, innovation, and society. So again, the intersection of business, society with a digital flavor. So some digital salt sprinkled on top of that.
And maybe we should add that so the reason why it's the three of us is because we are part of a network of several academics, a German network, and Ali, maybe you can say a little bit more, that focuses on grand challenges and new forms of organizing. And so the three of us, together with many other academics, we had discussions over 2 or 3 years now, again and again, about grand challenges and how to research them and implications, etc. And so that's why we're here together as a panel, I guess. Yeah.
No, it's great. It's great to have you all as a panel today. Katharina, I noticed you mentioned that you are near Coventry, which has hit the news yesterday with the first COVID vaccination being rolled out. So must be very close to where you are. Another grand challenge, huh?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Fantastic. All right, Christopher, do you want to start us with talking
about? Yes, so let me start by talking about impactful research. I'll share my screen with you. Just a second. So I hope you can all see that and see little faces on the side. So basically, I want to address the question of, well, impactful research, why we need it, what it is, and how to do it. And the talk is pretty much based on an editorial that I've written together with some other editors of the Journal of Management Studies, which is available online for a few days since now. And well, we basically put grand challenges really pretty much in the foreground of our little essay. And our aim with writing that was, of course, to inspire scholars and interested academics to do more impactful research and really focus and zoom in on various forms of grand challenges. So just to, yes, this seems to be working. So just that we are on a common ground here, let's just briefly recap what are actually grand challenges. Are we talking about the same thing? So we're picking here a definition which was put forward by George et al., and which is has become one of the most common or commonly used definitions of grand challenges. So it is a specific critical barrier that, if removed, would help solve an important societal problem with a high likelihood of global impact through widespread implementation. So that's of course still a little bit abstract, but you already see in the background the picture of the Sustainable Development Goals. So George Dahl in their essay, and hence many other scholars which are picking up this framework of grand challenges, argue that, well, the SDGs basically provide the best possible framework that we currently have about what are actually these grand challenges. So I won't review all the 17 SDGs, and I assume that you're somewhat familiar with them. So it's about climate change, inequality, fair labor conditions, justice, and sustainability more broadly. However, the question is, and this is why one of the reasons why we're having this workshop here today, and also why we wrote this editorial I was speaking about, are management researchers doing enough to help tackle these grand challenges? And well, as you can probably guess, our answer is no. But then the question is, well, if the answer is no, how can we do better? So here's just some pictures that illustrate that we would argue that there are grand challenges such as climate change or inequality or COVID-19 as we speak, but still it's still too peripheral to management research. We don't say that there's no research about it. In fact, there's a lot of research that is picking up these things, but still it's not as mainstream as we would like to have it. And one explanation is, and this is what we argue, that so why this lack of attention to grand challenges? We start with a few provocations that may provide an answer on this. So we argue that as yet impactful research and the way it is treated and understood by management scholars is too often understood as that which helps managers run their business more efficiently or effectively. So while this may sound nice, it does create some problems. And we argue that there are three key problems associated to this. So one is that it's too narrow of an orientation of the target actor. So it typically impactful research, when it's conceptualized and thought of, it primarily has business managers in mind. Second provocation is that there's a too narrow focus on the target locality. And of course, this connects to the first problem of the business manager focus. We argue that too much of research focuses on business firms and not organizations more broadly. And the third problem is that there's also too narrow outcome orientation. What do we mean by that? It's basically that in too many studies that are published and that speak of being impactful or that aim to be impactful, it's too often only a derivative of financial performance that is the main dependent variable. So it seems that all we care about is financial performance, and that of course is a problem. And that brings me to my next point. There is, in fact, in coming to that latter problem with the too narrow outcome, there's a myriad of other neglected measures of social or ecological performance that we still don't know enough about, and we should take them into account more often in our research. There's also not just business firms, there's all kinds of unconventional organizations, not firms, that need to be managed. So being a manager doesn't imply that you're in a business firm, and it doesn't imply that you're mainly trying to be more efficient or more effective. And at the same time, well, that connects to the previous point, all kinds of other contexts, and this is just an illustrative example here, need a manager, so to say. So when we think of manager, it is too narrow if we only think about a manager running a business firm, but it can be a manager running, for example, a refugee camp, or somebody, a group of people who is managing an unconventional organization. And the picture I show here is the ocean cleanup project that you may have heard of. So the consequence here is that we need to broaden our understanding of what constitutes impactful research, for whom it is relevant, and in which context and which goals it may help to achieve. And my argument is that it has been too narrow in the past. So how do we go about broadening the meaning of impact? And this is kind of the essence of the editorial that we try to write down in a concise manner. So first of all, we try to come up with a broader definition of what is impactful research. And we argue that Impactful research is that which influences through multifaceted forms and channels how organizations and individuals think, behave, or perform. And what we try to make emphasize here is that it explicitly does not include business firms and business managers, and it also doesn't constrain itself to a specific form of impact. So what is impact, and how can we look at and distinguish different forms of impact? We argue that there are 5 key forms of impact that management research can address. And we don't aim to be exhaustive in this list, but is we say these forms are, we give a pretty good picture of what would be a holistic understanding of impact. So first we say there's scholarly impact, that is the more or less classical aim to derive a theoretical contribution, but with a purpose. There's practical impact to better do things. There's societal impact to better understand and solve societal problems. There's policy impact to help create better policies. And there's also educational impact to foster research-based teaching and education. So let me give a snapshot of each of these forms of impact, and just I'll be very brief given the time, and then I'll just kind of tease it to you, and then we have more time for discussion later. So what are key components of scholarly impact? What the community generally regards as a scholarly impactful contribution is one that emphasizes novelty. So the question here is, what do we know after reading the paper or hearing about the research that we didn't know before? And the challenge here is that, well, that research has a scholarly impact if it challenges how we currently think about a phenomenon. The next component is interestingness. And here you probably have heard about the work of Alvesen and Sandberg on problematization. And they argue that research is interesting if it problematizes theoretical assumptions. But we argue that, well, there are also assumptions that we have in real life, and there are assumptions about pressing societal concerns that resonate with people's lives. And we can equally, or in a similar way, problematize these not so theoretical assumptions. So for example, there's interesting research that we take as an illustrative example of Chaudhuri on how entrepreneurship works among refugees and what kinds of assumptions we have on this. There's work by Whiteman and colleagues on planetary boundaries, or there's very interesting work by Karanovich et al. On supposedly opportunities that Uber drivers, well, in fact, don't really have. And the third element is importance. So, and here we argue that research is important if it seeks or succeeds in linking important theoretical problems or puzzles with important societal problems. And so these things are not necessarily distinct. And there's a very interesting study by Arslan and Tarakshi, for example, that look at a fairly theoretical problem of exogenous shocks and how they impact innovation performance, but they do so in a very important and relevant context, namely the Ebola outbreak of 2014. And because they also study the development of a vaccine, this has very high implications for our current research and treatment of the COVID-19 pandemic. So lastly, we argue that when seeking to make a scholarly impact, research should be problem-driven and phenomenon-oriented. That is, we don't at all argue against theory. We argue that theory and deriving a theoretical explanation of a phenomenon is very important. But there's a fundamental shift in the way we treat theory, namely that theory becomes a means for the end of better understanding a societal problem. The issue with that is that in too many studies, theory is an end in itself, and the empirical material that is at hand is nothing more than an illustration. And we argue that we should go around that. Practical impact, how about translating and applying your findings? So we observe that there's a move from practices that improve effectiveness of work systems, for instance, and the bottom line, towards those practices that matter for a specific audience or group of practitioners. So what's important here, and relates back to these 3 provocations I illustrated before, when we think of practical implication or practitioner, again, this is not necessarily a manager in a business context, but it can be a social worker, an activist, an NGO worker, I don't know, the manager of a refugee camp that is also practicing certain things. And so there's a specific audience that needs to be defined, and that also can benefit from research having practical impact. So we say here that why doesn't research consider business managers and employees, customers, social workers, NGO workers, policymakers, social movement actors, and so on. And while it is in fact probably true that most practitioners don't read academic papers, that doesn't necessarily mean they don't have a practical impact. So what we argue for is that we as scholars, why don't we consider a scholarly paper as a first necessary step to offer practical implications? What does it mean? So for example, you publish your paper in JMS or in any other distinguished scholarly journal where there's maybe little in the paper itself and that has practical impact. However, without the paper, you would not have anything to translate. So what is done very often, and there are very nice examples out there, that scholars use the research they have conducted and published in a journal as the foundation for, let's say, a short essay that's published in Harvard Business Review or a blog or in another outlet that is actually read by managers. But we argue that these essays or short cases or illustrations that we as scholars would write up for a practitioner audience, they will be much better if they are based on a thorough research that builds the fundamentals of the phenomenon that is being addressed. And then the next and the third step could be, okay, so you have the research published in a journal, is more theoretical in nature, it's being translated to a more practitioner-oriented outlet, and then it can ideally be applied or co-created together with the practitioners at hand. Let's move to societal impact. So I've talked about the SDGs before, and in fact that they're very broad. So what we suggest here to achieve or do research that is high on societal impact is that it's very important to zoom in on specific problems. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult to manage in terms of actually doing the research and writing it up in a concise manner. So while it might be good to have grand challenges or the SDGs as a label that gives us a common identity or a sense of belongingness. We are researchers that care for grand challenges. Saying that my research studies grand challenges, that's maybe a bit too broad. So what we suggest is focus and break down. So rather than saying I'm studying the SDGs, saying, well, I study SDG number 12, just as an example, and I'm zooming in on a specific industry or specific locality or context to see what's going on with respect to that. And what is helpful in this respect is to also consider alternative formats. So what we see not only among JMS, but also among many other journals in management and organization theory, like organization studies, also is alternative article formats, such as essays, that in some cases provide a better opportunity to emphasize the societal impact of your research. And also there's an increasing number of special issues in many of the mainstream journals that well specifically orient or seek research dealing with these issues. There's also policy impact. So what we observe here is that business conduct and governmental regulation are deeply intertwined, but management scholars, unlike many economists, have remained surprisingly silent on matters of public policy. So this is increasing in some areas. So for example, scholars of corporate social responsibility increasingly recognize that well, real sustainability is more driven by a governmental regulation than by voluntary actions of companies, but this is only an example. So we say that management research can also strive to have a higher impact on policy making, and we come up with a so-called ACE framework. There's that illustrates three aspects of policy impact. So what are these components? They are advocacy, control, and ethics. So we argue that published research that has a high chance of making a policy impact is strong on advocacy. That means they add these scholars conducting that research, and we do give examples in the editorial. They advocate their position and they partner with activist organizations, for example, in order not to maybe have direct influence on policy, but to have an indirect influence. Next, there's control. So here for researchers, it is important to know about and then make a selection on which policy instrument the research could address. So one instrument is, for example, regulation, and through that to control thinking, behavior, or performance. From that, however, the way of controlling thinking, behavior, and performance emerge ethical questions which need to be addressed. And we argue that it's also in that respect important to assess and foreground ethical implications of policy paradoxes, where, for example, one policy instrument has both good and bad consequences for a certain group of actors or society. Lastly, because most of us also teach in the classroom maybe half of their time, we should not forget about the educational impact that research can have in the classroom. And basically our argument is that without research, there's nothing to talk about in the classroom. And we should not forget that we are actually making a huge impact on students and education through our research. And that's my personal argument that we also make in the editorial, that good teaching should be based on good research. And these things are deeply intertwined. And in the editorial, we suggest different ways to integrate research into teaching. And there are first, there's what we call research-led teaching. So research is used to shape teaching material, for example, research-based case studies, or there's even article-based teaching, which is quite common actually in master programs specifically. There's so-called research-oriented teaching. So that is developing research skills and techniques. And we argue that this is specifically important in an era of post-truths and fake news, where we can equip students with rigorous lenses to make sense of the so-called real world and analyze, for example, what is more symbolic and what is more substantive. There's also research tutor teaching, which is engaging in discussions with students about research, and, for example, let students examine what is the frontier of knowledge or the state of the art of a specific debate or controversy in academia. And there's also research-based teaching, which is admittedly the most challenging one for us as educators. That is to actually involve students in the research process where students co-create knowledge. In light of the time, I should come to an end. So what's of course important, we kind of analytically distinguish these 5 forms of impact to kind of develop some more precise and hands-on recommendations. But of course, we should not forget that these different forms of impact are interdependent, and they often even reinforce each other. And one study is not restricted to only addressing one form of these types of impact, but can potentially address multiple ones. There's further inspiration available online. So if you're interested in reading about what I just talked about, you can find the paper on the website of the Journal of Management Studies. It's not assigned to an issue or so it's available under the accepted articles on the website. So that was my presentation. I hope it was interesting to you, and I would now hand over to Ali. Before that, I stop my screen sharing, and I give to Ali.
I was just wondering, should we address 2 questions that in the chat that were directly related to the presentation? I think they can be pretty quick. So one question was, Christopher, whether these 5 different forms of impact, whether there's a hierarchy.
So it depends from which point of view you look at that, right? So if you're, so we don't provide a hierarchy. We list them in the order as I talked about, but I would really emphasize that one form is not better than the other. And I think that there's different, so having a deep theoretical understanding of some issues is important. So we do not at all argue against theory. We do the opposite, but we only argue that theory is a means for an end of better understanding some aspect of a grand challenge. But for example, that's my personal opinion, and you may disagree, of course. I would say a lot of critical management studies research, maybe that's not so, and it's deliberately not so high on practical impact, but I think this is, and I personally do this a lot, this is excellent material to use in classroom discussions. So for example, if you talk about corporate culture or identity with students, and students typically find the dark side of things very fascinating. So maybe a business firm finds CMS research not so insightful, but students really care about this. This is my experience. So, and then there's research that lends itself high, like practice-oriented studies, or more if you have a micro-level studies on a particular organization, like a single case study, maybe that's higher on practical impact, but lower on policy impact, where if you have this high level, macro level study on inequality related to, I don't know, some macro level concept that is maybe more akin to make a contribution to in terms of policy impact. So I would really not want to say that there's any hierarchy, but different people have different preferences, and different research settings lend themselves to be stronger in one or the other area. Yeah, I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. And then just one more question, because I think it's good to get this out of the room, the big elephant in the room. Somebody asked whether it's more difficult to publish research on grand challenges. And since you're an editor, Christopher, you can maybe say something about how difficult it is to publish this kind of work.
I don't think it's more difficult. I would say it's easier, because that's what we want to have in the journal. So I mean, we wrote the editorial with a team of editors from JMS, but I think knowing editors from other journals, we desperately want this kind of research. We want research that's important and that makes a difference. So I don't know, if I have two papers on my desk to make a decision on, one is maybe a little bit more thorough on the methodology, but it's just completely boring. It's just like saying how performance is increased by a fraction of a percent. I mean, I just don't care about this kind. I don't think we need more of that stuff. And if there's another paper which is maybe a little bit weaker on the method, but it's just about exciting material, how climate change and inequality are related in an interesting under-researched context. I mean, that's exciting stuff. So my inclination to push this paper forward into the review process is much higher than a paper that is, maybe it's robust, but it's just boring. You know? So of course, every paper needs to meet the threshold of quality and methodological and theoretical rigor. But I think an exciting context that is being studied does a lot.
So I guess I'll do then the second presentation. Thanks, Christopher. You have a standing ovation, not a sitting ovation in Zoom, I guess. And maybe it was just a side comment. This is already the discussion, but I also say there's a desirability for grand challenge publications and submissions, but that might actually be also harder to publish it because there is not yet fully established theory on that, right? So there might be a desire by editors to see that. There might also be an additional challenge to write on these topics because the theorizing isn't as advanced as on performance metrics or so on. Anyway, well, that's maybe up for discussion later on. So this topic of grand challenge is really dear to my mind and heart and maybe body, given planetary boundaries, I'd say. And I'd like to give you some thoughts which are personal and obviously focus on research as well. And I won't share the screen. It's I'll share some links in the chat window from time to time. And I guess like many of you, I really came to academia through a combination of intellectual curiosity to understand the world of organizations and management, coupled with an ambition to produce knowledge that also shapes this world in a positive way, right? So like this dual mission. And as we're living through these troubled times of the COVID-19 pandemic, which Ibrahim already mentioned at the beginning, by the way, it feels sometimes like COVID-19 feels like Lord Voldemort in Harry Potter, like you know who, you don't want to mention it anymore. It's like, so, and when you someone asks you how do you feel, like, well, given the circumstances, I feel fine, and the circumstances obviously are COVID-19. But anyway, so we have COVID-19, we have growing populism, we have heightened inequality and the coming climate emergency. So we have a desire really to contribute not just to facing these grand challenges, but to really offering, I think, inspirational models for social transformation, which really has become greater, like the interest can become greater and also more urgent. And this urgency really has been exacerbated by institutional demands to demonstrate the societal relevance of science, as well as by populist attacks on science and the rise of anti-intellectualism, right? And there are really multiple strategies, I think, that academics can take. And I know I've seen some faces, some familiar faces, some of you do these things, right? So there are different strategies to embrace rigorous research with impact. And one that I've attempted myself is something like studying real utopias or heterotopias, right? So real utopias exist on the fault line between dreams and practice, and I draw on Wright's work here. They involve developing visions of alternatives to predominant institutions, while also remaining cognizant of the complexities and contradictions of realizing those ideals. So to study real utopias, I focused on alternative forms of organizing that exist on the periphery of the mainstream and demonstrate in a way on a small scale what could be possible. And these included, in my case, a digital social incubator, which was just published in RSO, I think 2 weeks ago, in a special issue on hybridity, an Islamic bank which tries to create a values-based business model in AMJ this year. And currently I work on a circular economy hub so as a case study. And I'm interested how this hub in Berlin-Neukölln tries to create a world without waste. Like, how can you dare to create a world without waste as a circular economy hub in Berlin, right? But I think focusing on these concrete examples allows us to access existing empirical data while also generating novel insights and implications for creating more sustainable and or equitable organizations. And as I mentioned, I'll share from time to time a couple of links just so if you want to follow up this conversation, here are some. Which really is on grand challenges, kind of like an overview lecture, and then 2 articles, one by Joanna Meyert and Rattert about alternative forms of organizing, which really gives a nice overview, and one which is really linked on to the social entrepreneurship literature. Now, the main practical and conceptual challenge, I think, with these alternative forms of organizing is precisely that they are alternatives. And those of you who do research in critical studies, you know of Gibson Graham's work. The two of them, they actually criticize this notion of alternative because obviously it puts things at the periphery. But these different novel forms of organizing, they often present small-scale social enclaves on the periphery that yet need to be translated into the center of society or scaled up without losing the essence of what rendered them inspiring examples in the first place. And even that is, I mean, there's a research question for paradox scholars, right? How do you scale up and stay true to yourself? So by identifying ways of meeting this challenge, I think scholars focusing on the periphery can then contribute to changing the mainstream, right? So we focus on the periphery, we change the mainstream by that. And we as academics then really co-create social change by theorizing and legitimizing occurrences at the fringe. And thinking about this is something I'm working on actually with Johanna Reinecke on a JMS essay, which is another Journal of Management Studies kind of focus. So we try to kind of theorize and think further how this is done. Now, maybe onto a bit grand challenges more specifically. The grand challenge notion really is, I think, and that makes it so tricky. It's not really a theory, right? It's a perspective, maybe a meta theory, a bit like paradox, right? And that makes it maybe hard also to publish about. And I'm happy to discuss, I guess, how to frame articles to get them into outlets. But I think it offers us a means to engage with central societal concerns of our time. It's almost like an excuse, right? It's like, since we have this term grand challenge, we have already a theoretical scaffold to use in our literature review and also in our contributions. And I think we develop a conceptual apparatus that speaks to impact and offers forms of theoretical contribution. I think that's key to get published. So linking this to the grand challenge discourse to SDGs or linking our work to the SDGs as Christopher did is helpful in 2 ways, right? One is it gives us a structure, but also it gives us actually an easier way into the practitioner world because the language practitioners use is something around SDGs oftentimes, so we can actually conceptualize around these terms, and that offers us an easier way to translate our work and have more potential impact. And again, a couple of links on this topic here. I mean, basically, next to a small lecture which goes into grand challenges, then there's the two, I guess, key articles. And I guess if one wishes to, and for those who are new to the grand challenge literature, I think one way into it is look at the two pieces, I mean, which already Chris has mentioned, so Jerry George, and the other one by Fabrizio Ferraro, Joel Grehman, and Dror Etzion in Org Studies. So I think these two are really, they have kind of framed the debate. They allow us, and through the articles which cite them, I think we get a feeling and an overview what is actually written about this. So I guess an easy way into it is to simply see who is citing these two pieces. Now, at the same time, I think we need to be careful when we talk about grand challenges that we don't, I guess, don't study organizations who just talk about it and don't walk the talk, right? There's a lot of greenwashing going on. And at the same time, I think we also need to be careful that we don't greenwash our own research, right? There are lots of papers which just add the grand challenge notion on it somewhere without actually engaging in this topic. And then maybe, I mean, this is not a Trump-Biden debate, so there's maybe less controversy than in that, but maybe a slight disagreement with Christopher, but very slight. I think it is helpful to kind of focus on one SDG, that is true. At times, though, I think, and there's a nice piece by Sachs et al. In Jeffrey Sachs and et al. In Nature or Science, where they link different SDGs together. And this is not contradictory to what Chris said, but actually complementary. That I think it is helpful to also think what have these grand challenges in common, and how can we theorize the commonalities of these grand challenges, right? And you could say, well, let's look at ecological grand challenges, let's look at social grand challenges. So how are they actually linked to each other? And this really is a discussion also we have in our DFG, so our German Research Fund network, which Katharina has mentioned before, on grand challenges. We have 15 scholars plus colleagues we invite from time to time. I mean, Jennifer Holt-Grenville, Johanna Reinecke, Johanna Meyer, they all came as visitors, and Katharina and Christopher, they're both members of that network. And there's also a forthcoming RSO special issue on grand challenges coming 2021 in the summer, if we're all still alive at that time. So much more discourse really is needed. And what one can really see at this body of work is there's something evolving around this notion of grand challenges. And I think this body of work is curated by some scholars I've already mentioned. I think it is impactful, but I also think it still requires more theorizing. It often fails at the stage of just being addressing something which is of significance to society. And here are the two links maybe to the network, just for you to follow up. I've posted them before when asked, but maybe if you're interested to follow what work we're doing in that network. So how to theorize the grand challenge, and again around grand challenges. That's, I mean, again, very, very briefly only. In a recent article, John, Amos, Laura Klaus, and myself, we link grand challenges to institutional theory. And I think that's something we need to do with different theories, right? Like, how do we bring this grand challenge notion into different theories? And in that paper, we advocate for further reflection on 4 analytical dimensions: macro level positioning, contextuality, temporality, and value plurality. And again, I'll just share the link. And as I said, I mean, I'll just rush over these things. But what we try to do there, so we have this grand challenge notion. It's not really a theory, but it's something we want to engage with. What does that mean for institutional theory? And there we speak about these 4 kind of dimensions. And first we say the notion of macro level positioning links organizing principles to macro level orders and embeds them in the interinstitutional system. So it embraces the environment as a key concern and logic, which means if you think about the grand challenge literature and the Ferraro et al. Piece in Org Studies, they say grand challenges have 3 facets. They are complex, they are uncertain, and they are evaluative or multi-jurisdictional. So they're complex, really intertangled. They're uncertain, we don't really know what will unfold, and they're multi-jurisdictional, so not a single jurisdiction can really tackle it. Or they're evaluative, they are actually, different people have different views, and we don't need to think about Trump and co. for different views on certain issues. So then this macro level positioning speaks to the complexity aspect. Then the second one, contextuality, moves away from, I think, a rather northern-centric focus and takes into account the plurality of logics and their interaction across interinstitutional systems. And as many of you know, most of our work is unfortunately still Western focused. Our theorizing is also Western focused. Now these grand challenges, as Katharina pointed out, are global. but our theorizing often is not. So that obviously then also speaks a bit to the complexity facet in terms of a spatial widening, right? The third point there is then on temporality, which is about the consideration of changing logics and logic constellations over time. And here really it speaks to the uncertainty facet that, and I mean, I've seen and reviewed many papers where logics are just jumping around, which obviously doesn't work, but logics are resilient social structures and practices like institutions, right, who form a coherent whole, but that doesn't mean that they cannot change. So they can change. Think about the family logic. 100 years ago here in Germany, the family was generally kind of the nuclear family between man and woman. Now it's also between man and woman. Who knows what will unfold in the future, right? So these logics are changing. And then finally, value plurality as the fourth concept brings back attention to the value-ladenness of logics themselves and offers a means to question concepts such as the market and the market logic, right? So what we think is the market is an own interpretation of the market, right? It could be otherwise. We could think about the market in a different fashion. And that really speaks to the evaluativeness facet of grand challenges. And I think integrating on these 4 dimensions in that piece, we kind of contend that this will contribute towards a transformative institutional logic perspective in the sense that they offer key implications for our engagement with grand challenges. So in a way, I mean, you probably know the literature on transformation studies, which is wonderful. I wonder actually whether we can bring in transformation studies into our different theories, right? Almost transform our theories to make them more impactful. Now, however, this also requires thinking further about methods and practices as a scholarly community. I mentioned the northern bias, for instance, and here another link I'd like to refer to a recent European Management Review piece where we think about methods and community and theory, again with John Amos, who also works wonderfully on inequality. So here we argue for contextual expertise. And I think that's, again, something which is key if we want to unfold because grand challenges further, right? If we want to deconstruct them, because they are global in nature, they are global and local at the same time. So we construe contextual expertise as the ability of an individual researcher, or more likely a research team, to be able to generate a depth and breadth of understanding of the empirical context across the entire research process, which means effectively a competence to really be able to engage with certain topics. So not the Western scholar being helicoptered into Sudan, but actually a deep understanding of that context, for instance, or elsewhere, right? It's not just about space, it's also about different other identities we have, while also maintaining the critical and respectful distance required to grasp the relationship between concepts, so being critical. And this is something, for instance, gender studies scholars have worked with a lot. And I mean, we also talk about reviewers and how they have to rethink then actually to review, because oftentimes if then a woman writes about gender studies, she is prejudiced of being biased, right? The person from Sudan is biased, whereas I guess the standard common or the majority scholar from the West who is male is not, right? So we also need to rethink our own biases there. So all this then really has implications for how we choose research sites, how we capture data in research teams, and how we construct research teams, how we analyze data in teams, and also how we present it. And this is also something Christopher mentioned with the essays, the JMS essays and alternative formats. I mean, in a way, our spectrum of work has really widened. There are increasingly alternative and post-publication practices that we can and should engage in, right? So these are essays. I mean, AMD, so Academy of Management Discoveries, has these post videos after a paper is published. And all these, I think, are manifold ways constructed around pieces that have huge impact. So for instance, if we take climate change research, we may wish to unpack diverse organizational practices across different localities, right? For which we need specific contextual expertise, and then bring it together, the micro and the macro, and ponder upon climate change as a grand challenge, empirically, conceptually, and methodologically. So ultimately, we as scholars can offer really a package of ideas, concepts, and thoughts, which together transform scholarship and practice. And again, here I'd like to mention a couple of, initiatives which we try to do these things. There's the Think List from the Bath University. There's the Research on Responsible Business and Management Network. So organizations which try to bring us together and also kind of, create places where we can amplify our voices and then kind of engage in different discourses. So in order, and I'll come to an end, in order to engage with grand challenges, we also need to rethink our community and how we work together, but also how we recruit, train, and evaluate scholars. Just as a side note, Imagine you create a vaccine. You are the key person as a scientist who found the vaccine, and you publish it in AMJ, which is maybe not the right outlet for that, but let's say Nature or Science. That is one publication on your CV, which is probably not the right measurement for finding the vaccine. So to summarize, there's a momentum to engage grand challenges. I think, especially in our community, there are scholars who really care about this, who are influential, who are offering ways into it. But there's also a necessity to engage with these topics given planetary boundaries, given our effectively human behavior on this earth. And in order for us to contribute towards theory and practice, we really need to think further in the sense of what we do. And I think I kind of briefly went into what this means for theory, methods, and community. And with that, I think I'll turn to Katharina. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Ali. That was a very good kind of broad view of different topics. So let me share my screen. As I said at the beginning, I will, let's see. Yeah, I think I will talk a little bit about how to get started. So if you're now interested in doing research on grand challenges, what do you do, kind of? And in order to do that, I want to chart a little bit my own journey. And I just want to keep track of time. So it all started in 2015 when I was in a deep postdoc crisis. I just finished my PhD and I was like, oh my God, what if I only publish my research in management journals and I realized nobody outside academia is reading these journals. So this was not why I wanted to become an academic. So I was really sitting there, I'm like, okay, I need to change my research. I want to do research on things that are really important. And that at that time, yeah, I think the notion of grand challenges was slowly coming up, but it wasn't really there in the mainstream kind of management research, I would say. And I'm personally an ethnographer. So what I did, I just went to some kind of events because, yeah, as an ethnographer, you want to go and see what people talk about. And at the time I was living in Switzerland, I was spending a lot of time outdoors. And so naturally, I was interested in climate change. In Switzerland, you see all the glaciers receding, etc. So climate change is basically always on your mind. And so there were some events in Zurich organized by climate activists, and I was talking to them and just, what's going on, what's kind of on your mind. And they said, oh, well, there's this new thing coming up in finance. Finance is slowly starting to realize that climate change is a bad thing. It's actually a risk for their assets and for the stability of financial markets. The governor of the Bank of England has kind of picked up this topic and he's kind of promoting it. And I'm like, oh, this sounds interesting. Finance has never really cared about climate change. So why are they now starting to care about climate change? And what does it all mean? I decided at that point there was a kind of social movement, climate activist group in Zurich, which was called Fossil Free. And I joined them. So basically their intention was to convince pension funds, banks, insurances, etc., to divest from fossil fuels. And my idea was just, well, I'm just going to hang out with these guys and find out what is the problem and what's going on in the market, etc. And I always so for 2 years, I called it my hobby project because I had other projects going on that I had to deal with during the day, basically. And the good thing about climate activists is that they meet in the evening and on weekends. So I could very conveniently in the evening, I could go and do my observations and do my interviews, etc. And I joined them on weekends when they organized their events. So over 2 years, I kind of collected 130 hours of observations. Obviously, I didn't just stick with the climate activists because I was kind of interested in the broader phenomenon. So I also read a lot in the news, and I also did interviews with a variety of different stakeholders in this area. So I did an interview with somebody from a bank, from an asset manager, etc., because I just wanted to kind of get a picture from different kind of perspectives. At the end of these 2 years, or kind of over that time, I realized the problem is actually much bigger than I initially, than I thought. And if I want to do a proper study, I need a team. So I could have done a study about how social movements are trying to convince investors to divest from fossil fuels. But the problem was actually much bigger in the sense that the whole financial system was suddenly realizing that climate change is a risk, and they have no clue how to deal with it. So, I mean, finance, their expertise is in modeling risk and taking opportunity of risk, right? So that's their core expertise, but they had no clue how to do this with climate change, because all their risk models are kind of like 1 year. And that's it. With climate change, you need 50 years. And in addition, you need to work with climate scientists who produce these very complex kind of models of emission pathways, IPCC, etc. And so the problem was much bigger, and it also involved a lot of more stakeholders. So there were NGOs involved, there was the regulator, there were the investors, there were data providers, etc. So I felt like I had an ecosystem, and I felt, okay, if you want to do this properly, you need a team. And then in 2018, I moved to Warwick. And in 2019, I finally found a grant scheme that would allow me to do the research project that I always dreamt about. Basically, what I wanted to do was to do kind of like a multiple years, in this case it's 4-year ethnographic study of how this change of financial market practices is unfolding. So for a while I was looking into different grant schemes, and none of them would allow me to do what I wanted to do, but this one particular scheme in the UK allowed me what I wanted to do. So they gave me money for a team and for 4 years of ethnographic study. And I was lucky enough to win the grant. And so actually we now started in October with 2 postdocs and a PhD student. And over the next couple of years, we're going to look at how investors deal with climate risk. So this is my journey, and maybe to share some of the lessons that I learned along the way. So first of all, my suggestion is follow your own interests and passions. So as you see, I was particularly interested in climate change. So that's where I started, but you probably have other different interests and passions. So follow that, because that's quite helpful, because it gives you the emotional energy that you need in order to kind of follow through with that. Then, just open a newspaper, just join a public event and just see what people are talking about. What are the controversies that they're discussing? What are the problems that they're trying to solve? And then think about, so how can organization theory or management research in general speak to these challenges, problems, and controversies? And maybe here at that point I can add, so personally, through my journey, I was always interested in this connection between what's happening in the micro, so what people locally do, and then what's happening on the macro level. And this phenomenon of climate risk in financial markets was exactly that, because what in the next couple of years, what will emerge, how financial markets will measure and manage and monitor climate risk, emerges through what people are now doing in various different locales, and there's nobody in control of the system. Of course, the regulator is trying to intervene, the NGOs are trying to do stuff, etc. Everybody's trying to do something, but nobody's in control of the whole system. But all of their local actions kind of build up to some larger macro changes, and so kind of that. So this kind of theoretical interest fit very well with the empirical phenomenon that I was observing, and so that's how then also ended up framing my research proposal. Then my suggestion is take time to familiarize yourself with the topic. So as you can see, I started in 2015, and actually in 2020, I'm properly starting to do the research, so 5 years. It might not take 5 years, but the thing is that with these kinds of problems, because they are grand challenges, they are complex, they're multidimensional, blah, blah, blah. So you need time to really understand them. I think as Ali said, you need to really understand the contextuality around it. So you need to understand who are the players, what are they trying to do, what are their different interests, etc. And so my next suggestion is also try to take a long-term view. I personally committed to this research agenda. I want to do research on climate change in financial markets for the next 20 or 30 years, I hope, if I stay around for that long. But it's on the one hand, these problems are not going to go away. So you have an opportunity to do long-term research. And on the other hand, I think as Ali said, if we want to have impact in various ways, we need to become experts in these topics. And the way we can become experts is if we take a long-term view. And this doesn't mean that you have to do like a really long project that I'm doing now, but you can also do multiple smaller projects. But it's not, you know, you cannot just jump around. One day you're researching renewables in this area, and then the other day you're researching something else. There needs to be kind of a connection between the things that you're trying to research. Then what I did, I spoke to as many people as I could. So that's also my suggestion for you. Obviously, you want to talk to the various practitioners. So as I mentioned, I talked to a lot of different stakeholders involved in this game. And what you will find, each of them, they have different interests. So that's always interesting and helpful to see. All of them have their own theory of change, which is also interesting to understand. And most of them will also try to shape your research, because for them, it is also, most of the people who are dealing with these issues, they're also personally kind of involved in them. And so they also have a kind of personal motivation. So they will try to support and yeah, shape your research, I guess. Talk to other academics in your discipline. On the one hand, it gives you the emotional support. On the other hand, of course, the theoretical inspiration that you need in order to frame kind of the research that you're doing. And then also talk to other disciplines, obviously, since grand challenges are interdisciplinary by definition. Then seize the right funding opportunity. As I said, I looked at multiple different funding opportunities, and none of them were really fit for the kind of project I wanted to do until this one particular grant scheme came around. So it takes a lot of effort to find the right funding scheme, but if you do find it, also the chances that you're winning, that you can win the funding are much higher. And then, yeah, define and redefine the right scope of the research, because grand challenges, yeah, by definition, they're complex, but they're also obviously continuously changing because people are working on them. And so as I speak, everybody in a lot of people in financial markets are working on the problem of climate risk. So the problem itself is also continuously changing. And so you may need to define the scope of your research as you go along. And that's a fairly difficult and complex task. And with that, I just want to mention 3 more resources that I found particularly useful. There's an impact scholarly community from AOM. It's the one division and another division. So they host really useful webinars on how to create impact. And then kind of from a methodological point of view, as I said, I'm an ethnographer. So I found Paula Jozakowski's work particularly helpful. And these are 2 methods papers that look at that are quite helpful. And with that, I think we're done with the presentation part and open up for questions. And now I can stop sharing.
Thank you, Katharina, and thank you, Christopher, and Ali for very insightful perspectives. We're going to open now for questions. The way we're going to do it is we want to make this experience of the webinar as personal as possible. So if you are able to unmute yourself and even turn on the video, perhaps ask your question directly, but please keep it succinct. Don't need long introductions. But if you're not able to ask a question directly, you can type it up in the chat, and I can read it out to the speakers. Who would like to go next first?
Yeah, so I would have a question. Sure, if I can just start. Okay, perfect. So thanks a lot for these presentations, Katerina. My question's directed to you mostly, as you were talking about funding schemes. I was wondering, are there any funding schemes that we as junior scholars can have a particular look at if we want to do research on grand challenges?
Yeah, I think it depends very much on your institutional context or in the country in which you're embedded. So I'm in the UK, and in the UK they have a lot of funding scheme for early career researchers, but also on the EU level they have really good, what is it, the Marie Curie Fellowship and some other funding schemes that unfortunately it's a very complex landscape, so you need to do some of your own digging into it, but it's definitely worth it. And maybe you can speak to some people in your university who have experience with different funding schemes that can help you. That's what I did. I talked to many different people to find out what could be the right funding scheme for me.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. I can see Lekha has raised her hand. Lekha, do you want to go next?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the opportunity. My question is this, and this is to Katerina, which is when you mentioned that, as an initial step, you can speak with practitioners to understand the landscape of the basic grand challenge that you're looking at. Say, for instance, it would include talking to certain organizations. How do you approach that specific part of interaction? Do you undertake it as proper interviews, semi-structured interviews, do some analysis? How do you synthesize the learning that you get from those interviews or whatever? Do you treat them as a part of your research and put them into literature review? Or do you treat them as just casual conversation? You're trying, something like a dipstick that you try to wrap your head around what is going on in the practitioner world. How do you approach that? Is that based on the research question, or is there a best practice to go for it? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. I think you can do both, and I think both have advantages. So I could have certainly approached my hobby project as a proper research project, and I could have further analyzed my data, etc. Actually, people, when I told them about what I found with this social movement, they said, "Oh, you should write a paper about this," but I didn't have the time because I had other projects going on, and because I was eventually then decided to go for a funding scheme. And if you write a funding proposal, it takes a lot of time. So I just didn't have the time to analyze my data properly, unfortunately. So I treated it more as conversations that inspired me, that helped me think through the problem. Of course, I did some kind of preliminary analysis because I needed to write this funding proposal. So I did, but not proper analysis. I think you can do both. Yes, in the end, it depends a little bit, on being pragmatic, what you can do, what you have the time for, and what you don't have. And related actually to that, because you're mentioning the interviews, and I saw earlier a question in the chat about how do you get access to these different institutions. And I mean, in my case, I was trying to, talk to the regulator, the Bank of England, to investors, financial institutions who are usually very secretive, etc. But what I found was because this is such an important, like in financial markets, climate change, I would say before COVID hit, climate change was on the top of the agenda. And so you actually do get fairly easy access because it's a problem for them. They don't know how to deal with it. They're desperately looking for people who can help. And so I think just give it a try, even though if you think, oh, ECB or some of these other European institutions, they will never talk to me, just give it a try. And I found most of them were actually more open than I thought. So with access, just give it a try, it works.
Thank you, Katerina. Before we move to another question being asked directly, I'm just going to read a question from chat from Ash Ganzuri. What's your advice on doing research on why and how entrepreneurs and innovative institutions approach grand challenges?
So I mean, I guess I'm happy to maybe respond to that because I also work on entrepreneurship. I mean, that's obviously a very, very broad question, right? And you could look at it from a micro perspective, at the motivation, at the intention, from the meso perspective, how they organize themselves, and from the macro perspective, link it to the underlying logic. So I'd say there are multiple facets of engaging with that. Maybe just one specific example. We've just had an article conditionally accepted at Journal of Business Venturing Insights on why entrepreneurs engage with COVID-19. And we examined that some entrepreneurs obviously started a foundation, but others also pivoted towards the social. So there, I mean, very specifically, the grand challenge of COVID-19, which is not supposed to be mentioned, so to say, is engaged with by entrepreneurs who pivot towards a social topic due to a crisis. And so I'd say it's a huge topic area, and that's just one way of engaging with that.
Can I add something here? So I would like to emphasize that in my opinion, I don't see that there's one best methodology to study grand challenges. So I would not at all say that ethnography is better suited, or I'm myself a qualitative researcher, but qualitative research is not, it's not necessarily better suited to study this than quantitative studies. So there's a lot of very useful insights, for example, related to long-term impact and relationships between different activities and, well, real improvements of some ecological or social conditions that quantitative studies can do much better. So I think you need to be open to different methodological approaches. And of course, that depends on your personal preferences, but in principle, any method is suitable depending what question you precisely want to ask, in which setting precisely you want to study.
Thank you. Sadek, would you like to ask a question, please?
Yeah, thank you, Brad. I'm a first-year student, PhD student from University of Louisville, so I'm pretty new to this. But what I wanted to understand first from Christopher is there any particular, like you have answered it kind of already, but is there any particular journals which are focused? I can understand now from the discussion that Journal of Management Studies might be one. That's the first question, like for publishing this kind of phenomenon-driven research. Second is, I have started working on an experimental design based on for the SDG 1. So that kind of like it's kind of freaks me out because it's kind of a very long design. I think it will take around like 2 years to conduct the study. So I have a couple of problems. First is obviously the funding for that. I want to hear more from Katharina. How did you approach? Like, did you first theoretically finished it, then approached? What was the journey? Because I want to learn from it. And secondly, do you think that experimental design being a quantitative study, it's a good approach, or should I look more into like non-experimental design the way Catherine approached in the beginning? So because I want to do it something better from the start so that I don't end up at being something like very crude at the end.
So maybe I jump in first. Thanks for the question, Sadek. So I would say, well, it always it depends. I would say there's not a specific journal that should be your primary choice for phenomenon-driven research. So I think, I mean, there's so many journals out there, but knowing at least the conversation that's going on among the let's say the more higher ranked management journals, such as, well, take AMJ, AMD, JMS Organization Studies also, they all do care about and are open to these kinds of things. So of course, what is required specifically for a general management journal, that your research or the phenomenon that drives your research, that it is thoroughly embedded into the extant conversation and a particular branch of management or organization theory. So you want to kind of pick up the conversation that is going on in these journals, and well, take theoretical insights which may come from any context, and try to link them to your specific context. But I think, yeah, specifically like AMJ, AMD, JMS, and org studies also, they are all very much open to these kinds of things. And then of course you have the even more the journals that are even closer to the phenomenon, such as Business and Society or Organization and Environment. So I think and this is a very good development, there's very ample room to publish such research, but the threshold is of course that it needs to be theoretically and methodologically rigorous. But I would say all things equal, if there's 2 studies and one addresses a topic which is just not important or exciting, and one is addressing a grand challenge that has the potential to yield some form of impact, I would always go for that one, given that the space in journals is limited, right? So that the focus on a grand challenge alone doesn't bring you into the journal, but given you meet the quality expectations of rigorous theorizing and method, I think that's a very good starting position that can open the doors. And I also see it among reviewers, right? I mean, I read so many reviews every day that reviewers like this kind of stuff, and they want to see more of it. And I hear from a lot of reviewers that I was intrigued by this context and that setting, and I was intrigued by this or that data set that the author generated, and I learned more about this or that grand challenge. Then you spoke about experimental design. It depends. So if you convince the editor or the reviewer, or say the reader of your paper, that in order to illuminate a particular aspect of a particular grand challenge, that an experimental design is the best possible way to achieve that, and it's conducted methodologically rigorous, that's fine. I mean, that's perfectly fine. So again, it's not possible to say that it's better or worse suited to find out something. What you want to find out and the method has to fit together. And if that is the case, anything goes, so to say. I think the other question was more for Katarina.
Yeah, and I think it was related to how I wrote my research proposal, right, Sdgs? So any specific questions or?
Yeah, like just before I want to mention that I am working on the poverty aspects, which is the first sustainable development goal. So I'm working on how entrepreneurship training can help in alleviating poverty. That's the like narrow research question. So for Katrina, what I wanted to ask is like, how did you went from, you have told that from 2015 you started this journey, but I want to understand more that how did you develop the theory and what was the process kind of like? Did you first, you said that you had this ethnographic studies done in the beginning. So how did these interviews help you in forming the theory, or how did you do that? So because I'm a very fresh in this field, so I wanted to know more about your journey on how you started this and when did you end up in getting that fund to do your experiment.
Yeah. So as I said, I think it's very important that you talk to both the practitioners and to other academics in your field. And basically I had a conversation. I was always going back and forth between what's the problem for the practitioner and what's from a theoretical perspective, what's interesting. And so I presented my research ideas to a couple of friendly reviewers, I would say, and not in a formal setting, but I just discussed with them, look, this is the phenomenon I'm looking at. This is what I'm interested in researching. Does this make sense to you? What feedback can you give me, etc. So I over the years I had multiple conversations with different people who always gave very different impact, and so I basically kept a logbook of all my conversations that I had, and then when I had to write the grant proposal, I sat down with my logbook and kind of read through, I don't know, 50 pages of notes, trying to make sense of what I discovered through my journey, and then just try to write the research, like kind of synthesize synthesize it, and then write the research proposal. And again, in writing the research proposal, I also asked for feedback from multiple parties. So I think really getting this feedback is really, really important for you in shaping the research proposal. Yeah, and then I think the other advice is look at successful research grant applications. So that's what I also did. I asked successful people in my field what they did to write good grant applications. I looked at their grant applications and then tried to kind of emulate. And I think it probably goes a little bit outside of the topic for here today. But if anybody is interested in kind of understanding this process of how to apply for grants, feel free to send me an email and we can have more chats about this. Yeah.
Thank you, Katharina and Christopher. Sophie Jane, would you like to go next with your question?
Hi, Brett. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, okay.
Good morning, or afternoon, I guess, everyone. It's morning in the US here. So I guess my burning question and what sort of keeps coming up as I think about grand challenges and impact is, you know, corporations particularly, right, a lot of the time are part of the problem. And I'm really interested, I guess this is an open question for the panel. How do you manage that tension between wanting to have impact and speak back to whether it's managers, corporations, firms, or other interest groups, but also acknowledge that the very people that you're speaking to are the people that are causing these issues and may be resistant to really looking at that or reckoning with that seriously?
So I'm happy to go first. Or Chris, do you want to go first?
No, go ahead.
Okay, sure. So yeah, I guess it's quite a complex question in the sense that obviously we talk to them on different roles, right? So one role would be we as scholars when we invite them in our institutions, and we have this institutional baggage that we obviously don't want to offend them because they might fund our institution and so on. So that is, I guess, a tricky thing. But oftentimes, I mean, there's one answer is they're often interested in finding responses that allow them to do both, right? Profit, value, and values. But I mean, sometimes that's obviously not working. And then I guess it's our task to offer them theoretical concepts and tools and so on to reflect on what they do. So I guess in my teaching with students, I have certain values, right? I believe in climate change and so on. I would never teach in a way that I would tell people to believe in climate change. So in a way, giving them the tools and reflection and thoughts gives them an ability, I think, to kind of reflect on their own wrongdoing, wrong in something. That's one side. The other side is, I think, I mean, we have options, right? Options to choose what to engage with. And I simply, in our research, so yes, the empirical data sets we get, they give us, like people and organizations give us access to them. At the same time, we also give them legitimacy by studying them. So I think on that side, on the empirical side, on the research side, we actually have the power to choose not to study certain of these organizations on certain topics, and instead choose others, right? So we don't need the 100th study on Jeff Bezos' responsible leadership style. We can look at smaller organizations to do so. Instead, we could obviously look at Amazon future work practices and the way they misuse and use technology, and then write about Amazon. So I guess we can choose, and our choice, I mean, there's the three phases of power, right? Decision making, agenda setting, and then preference shaping. Our choice of what to research on is a powerful one and has an impact on these corporates.
Yeah, and maybe, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, no, so I fully agree with Ali that we it's not just that just because we are embedded, or most of us probably are working in a business school, doesn't mean we have to study business or business managers. We can study other forms of alternative organizations, aid organizations, social movements, activists, and so on. And the other thing that maybe I can expand on what Ali said is that impact is not necessarily something that, well, a business manager finds useful, but there can be other forms of impact, like what I have sketched. For example, if you do a critical study on hypocrisy or greenwashing in a corporate context, and there's a huge body of literature on this. This can be very valuable in a classroom discussion. So, for example, I teach a course on corporate social responsibility, and I have one session and some assignments linked to that on greenwashing, and the students actually find that very interesting. So and of course that session is based on research about greenwashing. So even if a manager would never read that stuff or may not like it or say it's not true or it's fake news, whatever, the students find it very valuable. And I mean, these are the managers of the future. So even though if maybe the immediate practical impact is low, for example, the educational impact and through that the long-term societal impact can be very high.
Yeah, and I just want to build on these comments and offer a different perspective. And I agree with what Bernd wrote in the chat. He said that these organizations are often more interested than we think. Some are very aware that the way how they run their business destroys their own business. And that's my experience with financial markets. I'm talking to big financial institutions where you would think people are only profit oriented, but no, they have realized that if they don't like kind of figure out this topic of climate change, they're digging their own grave. And so it's in their own interest to kind of deal with this issue. And on the other hand, what you will also find in many of these very established institutions, so even if the big financial bank itself as a bank has not fully grasped it, you will definitely find people inside the bank who personally care a lot about climate change or other topics, and they will try to promote these topics within the organization. So you can start talking to these people and figure out, okay, what's their problem? How can I maybe help them that they can promote this topic in their organization, etc. So I agree with Bernd's comment. Sometimes they're more interested than we think.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, if I may just add to Katharina's point that I do some supervision work with the executive MBAs here at Cranfield. And I noticed in some of the projects that they work on, there are some people who work in the financial industry, with investment firms who are interested in investment, kind of impact investment and other topics related to this. So there's clearly, at least at individual level, there's an interest in how they're trying to tilt the organizations or the strategies in that direction. Next, Anna-Lena, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much. That was so interesting. My question is, it starts with a Twitter feud I witnessed, and there have been critical management scholars who are very, very critical of the term grand challenges in itself. So I would be interested in your take on whether the term grand challenges to start with actually kind of obfuscates the actual scope and scale of the societal problems that we're facing. What would your take be? Is climate change, for example, a bit bigger than just being a challenge or a grand challenge?
I guess happy to go first and just give a brief response. So Annalena, by the way, just finished a PhD, I think a week ago, maybe almost like yesterday, on CSR in the Middle East. So if you're interested in CSR in the Middle East, follow Annalena's work. To your question, aren't critical scholars not critical of everything, right? I mean, I don't know whether there's a single concept critical scholars are not kind of critical about. And I mean, I say this with irony, obviously. I think there's value in criticizing the concept, especially because it is, I mean, we live also in an industry which creates fashions and fads, right? Especially in management. And grand challenge definitely is something which becomes fashionable now and people jump on a certain train. And I guess my response to that is we shouldn't, so why I still like this notion, this concept is I'll explain in a moment, but I think what we need to do with that concept is link it to other existing concepts like Vickert problems and so on, right? So what we know from that literature, we should obviously bring into the grand challenge literature. Now, why do I still like this notion is simply because if you talk to, I mean, one is Vickert problems, for instance, in contrast, has quite a negative undertone, right? If you go to a practitioner and say, well, this is really a Vickert problem, like, I mean, it is a grand challenge. I think my son would probably prefer to solve a grand challenge instead of a Vickert problem, so to say. But also, I mean, the practitioners, politicians use this notion of grand challenges, SDGs, and so on. So our linkage towards practitioners is much easier with the grand challenge notion. So simply to have impact, I think it makes sense to use that language, bearing in mind that there's a lot of literature which has come before. Like 3 or 4 years ago, we had this discussion about like 10 different notions which are similar then to grand challenges, and that we should obviously kind of bring that literature in.
Okay, thank you, Ali. Sophia, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. I would like to discuss framing this kind of research briefly, which is something that Ali already offered, so I want to jump on that. And I think my question would be, yeah, how do you think we should frame this type of research? So should we, I mean, there's definitely lots of gaps in literature on all grand challenges. For me, that's degrowth. I mean, there's not even really a full-grown body of literature there, which we then can solve with kind of more established literature? Or do you think it would be better to kind of look for a gap in established literature that we then apply to a challenge? What do you think is a more sensible approach in general?
I would say, well, I mean, the way I approached my study is that it was very much problem driven and phenomenon driven. And so I think the danger, if you start with gap spotting in the existing literature, you might not see the big picture or the kind of the complexity of the problem, the empirical problem. And so, yeah, my suggestion would probably be to start with the complexity of the empirical problem and then look at, okay, so what literatures have already looked at this and tried to tackle it, and what have they already said about it, and where do we need to go beyond in order to build theory around how we can solve this particular empirical problem that I'm looking at. That I think that's the approach implicitly that I took.
I would probably agree, given that. So I mean that if we understand the publication process, or well, journals as a market for the best idea, best being the most interesting and the most theoretically insightful. If you have a meaningful story to tell, which you are likely to have if you study a specific or kind of a grand challenge with some clear boundaries, why hide it? So, I mean, if you say, I'm adding to this theory that principal agent theory, we know it for 2000 years already and nobody actually cares. And by the way, my research also helps to solve climate change. I mean, why hide that contribution that you can potentially make? And why not put it in the foreground? So my feeling is that the more exciting and the more interesting and important your empirical context is, the more you should put it into the foreground, because you have a higher chance to draw readers into the paper. I mean, and that's how the review process works. So the reviewers read it, and if they're immediately excited about it, they will read on, and they will probably be sympathetic about your research because it's just interesting and kind of intellectually stimulating. And if you hide that, that's just why it's not necessary. I would not do that. I would kind of foreground it, maybe even start the paper with the problem, and then say, okay, here's the problem, here's why it matters. And here's a particular theoretical perspective that can help us illuminate that problem.
And my quick, sorry, Katarina,
just a very quick comment. I organized a track at EGOS on grand challenges, I think it was 2 years ago. And somebody at that track, Charlotte Coutier, she presented like a very long list of literatures that speak to certain empirical problems that we might call grand challenges, right? And so the difficulty of, all I want to say is there are many different literatures that you can go to and theories that you can take in order to look at certain empirical problems. And that's why I said it's valuable to talk to many different other people that you know in your close circle or wider circle at conferences, etc., because then you will find all these different theories and look at, so where and how does my empirical problem speak to that? Yeah.
So my quick comment to this is, I mean, there's the option that, I mean, you mentioned degrowth, right? So you can use degrowth as the empirics. I think that is maybe under-satisfying simply because you want to do more with it, right? You can use degrowth as a theory that will not get published in AMJ, but maybe in Ephemera, right? Which is a wonderful journal. But if you have a different target audience, degrowth as a theory might be tricky. And then you have something in between where you either link degrowth, for instance, with a theory, which is fine, which I see very often, which I guess is a way in. Or, I mean, and that I think is very powerful, if you use degrowth as something which actually kind of criticizes and changes, adapts a theory, right? I mean, if you think about degrowth, it effectively, and I mean, I do lots on, obviously on logics and institution theory, degrowth effectively is counterposing the market logic, right? Like, what is it doing with that logic? So then it's not just interacting with the theory, but actually kind of, well, criticizing the core of a certain concept in a theory.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Lisa, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering how you would suggest us to deal with failure. And I'm thinking about at the moment, like none of the grand challenges is solved. They're there, they're existing, and everything we look at is like done by organizations who do, like in the end, they do not solve the problem at hand. Nevertheless, the papers often kind of praise or like explain what's going well and what's going wrong. And I have the feeling that many of the papers do not look at what's not going well. And like, especially like if we talk about greenwashing, that might be a phenomenon that is targeted specifically, but other phenomenon or like, especially like attempts to solve the challenge, which like kind of fail after some time, is not targeted that much. And I was wondering how you would suggest like to integrate that in talking about grand challenges. Yeah, kind of like looking at the dark side of how to manage them and this kind of stuff.
I don't know if I can jump in. So what comes to mind here is I would not say that there's no attention to these things. So I particularly from a researcher point of view, I tend to find it more interesting to understand things that don't work rather than those that work. So like a study on barriers to why we don't really make progress on grand challenges, I would say that immediately, or that's intuitively more interesting than something on best practices and success factors, because that's often a bit dull, I would say. So I think you can, because I mean, it is a matter of fact that we're not making sufficient progress on many of the grand challenges we have. So why not research that? And it's very legitimate, I think, to say, look, only if we know the barriers first that hinder or prohibit progress, we can better work to eliminate them. That can probably not be done in a single study, but if your study is about highlighting specific barriers and their interrelatedness with respect to a specific grand challenge, something like that would be extremely interesting, I think, and also can have a huge impact based on what I just said. So if we, how can we make progress if we don't know why we don't make progress?
Yeah, and I guess I would argue for the opposite side, which shows that you can argue for both. I think I read a couple of studies on climate change, and they were all explaining why we're not making progress on climate change. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, well, that's all good to know, but so what does actually work? And so I value studies that show maybe not as best practices, but kind of mechanisms how like things work. And I think the value a researcher can actually also bring is, and I think it goes back to what Ali said earlier, we can research like smaller, like in smaller contexts where things work, even though the theory said they don't work or they shouldn't work, or it's climate change is such a big problem and this shouldn't work. But then we can show, yes, it makes some progress and it leads to some solutions. So I personally I like those studies, but I guess you can do both. And maybe the ideal format would be a study where you point out, so here are all the barriers, and in addition I found 2 examples of how we can overcome these barriers. Maybe that's the best solution.
Okay, thank you. Gerard, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I'm a little troubled by the the question of grand challenges itself and the way they've been framed. I'll use climate change as an example. I actually posed this question in the chat, that is it climate change that's the grand challenge, or the generative mechanisms that cause climate change? And I'm troubled because I see climate change as a symptom, not the problem. The real grand challenge lies in the economic and social systems that generate it and perpetuate it. And if we simply play around only with climate change, there is another challenge coming down the road. And we will not have comprehensively addressed the fundamental issues that bring us to where we are today. It's similar with COVID, right? It's COVID didn't just happen. I mean, there were projections that before COVID happened that we would have these types of novel coronaviruses hitting us because of closer and closer proximity because of deforestation. So I think the question is getting to more fundamental issues that are really the causal mechanisms of where we find ourselves today and why we have grand challenges today. And by playing only around with climate change or COVID and these guys, I'm not saying they don't need to be solved. They absolutely need to be solved. But they don't get to the roots of the issue. So I was just wondering how you view that. I see the big challenges if we consider publication and all these things that are important to us as academicians. They also get in the way of truly getting to the roots of the issues. So I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Yes, I'm happy to respond to that. So thank you for that question. I guess, I mean, your root metaphor makes a lot of sense. And in a way, I think it also gives a partial answer to it, right? Because effectively the roots and the tree are connected. So I wouldn't say one is the grand challenge and the other one is not. COVID-19 and climate change and our behavior are all kind of included in that grand challenge. Now, how do we engage with that? I mean, there's a nice piece in Org Studies by Andrew Hoffman, who has published other pieces also on things like the relationality between human beings and nature, right? And this is more fundamental. I mean, and it speaks to Bruno Latour's work on the Anthropocene, right? So I'd say if we rethink our understanding of certain concepts and so on, we can really fundamentally rethink our theories. So, I mean, but for instance, how do we bring in animals and nature into our theorizing? Do we give them agency like STS scholars would do? Or how could we, if we don't want to be that radical, how do we want to bring them in? In the piece I'm currently working on, I look at how nature is incorporated in a new form of organizing as an agency and how it shapes the boundary of the organization. So I think all that, speaks to that. I'd say it is included in the grand challenge, but you're right. I think we see symptoms and implications of something which are grand challenges in themselves. Underlying it is human behavior as a whole, which needs to drastically change, or nature will change us.
Okay.
Maybe just thoughts that come to mind in line with Ali. So Gerard, I mean, I fully agree with you. And there are certainly factors, and I agree with those that you mentioned, that cause various grand challenges. They are intertwined, and then there are things which are caused by these grand challenges, and there's probably a high degree of circularity in this. But I also think in terms of kind of what can we do as individuals and how can it inform our research, it needs to be manageable. And I think in that respect, it does make sense to pick out an aspect, either something, if you focus your research on an input or an output factor or the process, so to say, that makes it more manageable and can probably need to lead to a bit more meaningful contribution. Maybe has a small scale impact, but it does have some sort of impact. Rather, if you address the whole circle, that would be beautiful, of course, but maybe it's a bit too overwhelming. Then I wouldn't really know how to actually study that.
Yeah, I think
even though I agree with you.
There's one possibility there, I think, but it really requires us to rethink how is, for instance, multidisciplinary research, that going across, that we tend to publish within our own journals, and the idea of really cutting across scientists and sociologists and management researchers working together and creating large projects of that kind that truly bring the multidisciplinary nature of these problems together. I think that there is some work, right, for instance, from the Stockholm Resilience Institute, et cetera, that you see 25, 30 authors on an article. But I think I would think we need a lot more of that.
Thank you, Gerard. Subhajan, would you like to ask your question?
Hello, hi. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. This has been a very informing workshop, panel discussion for early career researchers like me. I have a very specific question, and it's an open question. Anyone can address it. What do you think are the future research opportunities, more specifically, if we have to connect systems thinking and grand challenges? As I am an entrepreneurship researcher, it will be helpful as well if you can highlight that how do we apply systems thinking in research on grand challenges, more specifically at the interface of entrepreneurship and sustainability. I mean, what contributions can we make if we, what kind of research opportunity? Because I think systems thinking is increasingly being connected towards addressing grand challenges, if I'm not wrong. But then how to translate that in manageable research objectives?
So what I can say to this is that on the one hand, I do agree that systems thinking can be very helpful because it does emphasize the interrelatedness between all of these things. And one grand challenge or one SDG is typically influenced by another, even though it makes sense to zoom in. But they're not like disconnected or mutually exclusive. At the same time, I do have to admit that I'm not really familiar with this. So it's floating around. And for example, Tima Bansal has recently published a small commentary in Journal Management Studies where she calls on for more system thinking to address urgent sustainability issues, which are related to or overlapping with grand challenges framework. But I wouldn't know how exactly you can do that, I have to admit. So that's something I also have to learn.
Yeah, and I mean, I also am not very familiar with systems thinking, but in my experience, and practitioners do use system thinking a lot as well in their way of how they think about grand challenges. And I think it only gets you so far. And I think with grand challenges, because these problems are often also very new to us, we might also need other approaches. So systems thinking is one way, but I think there are also many other ways. And again, my suggestion would be start from the empirical phenomenon and see what you need in order to make sense of the empirical phenomenon.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Before I can see Sadek, you raised your hand again, but before we let you ask a question, I just want to read questions that are in the chat, which we missed so far. And it looks like some people who asked those questions already left, but I'll ask anyway, because I think they're relevant questions. So May Saitanidi earlier asked, what are the analytical boundaries or should be when focusing on one or more SDGs? Any suggested frameworks? How is Katarina operationalizing climate change or action?
The analytic, what was it again? The analytical boundaries?
What are the analytical boundaries or should be when focusing on one or more SDGs? Any suggested frameworks?
Do you mean kind of what theories or perspectives are adequate for this?
No, I mean, how you operationalize it, because as we know, the boxes that we see for the SDGs, they seem discrete, but they're not necessarily discrete in real life. Yeah. So in real life, there are far more interdependencies than are explained or made explicit in each box of the SDG. So when you start studying one challenge, it's basically you see many boxes being unfolded and opened at the same time. So how do you keep all the boxes open or closed? Or should we allow them? And that kind of links with the previous systems thinking approach, right? Or complexity theory. So in complexity theory, which is different from systems thinking, is that you allow the emergence of new order to come about, as opposed to systems thinking that you don't allow this to happen. So how do you operationalize this, or should we, or to what extent, to what level?
There's probably not one best way, but as a qualitative researcher, for example, if you do field research, what I would do and what I would actually find quite interesting is, well, let the natives tell you how they are interconnected. So I mean, there's high-level politicians talking about how the SDGs are interrelated, and we're doing this kind of from the ivory tower and our bird's eye perspective. But how are they actually interconnected in that little village somewhere in the desert? You know, where the natives reside and where they kind of feel climate change is happening because of desertification, and that causes inequality among women and men, and children can't go to school, and you already have 3 SDGs basically. So I would, that might be a starting point. So how do the informants or the natives that you're studying, how do they experience that interconnectedness? I wouldn't really have a good answer on this, which kind of means we should study it. That's one way.
We are.
I think that, sorry.
We are studying it, and we have a problem, you know, with an R&R paper, which is about, you know, food poverty, and it's about 2 SDGs, and the reviewers are asking how many, why not others? But then you can't operationalize, right? And you can't unpack it necessarily within a paper. So
I mean, if the data allows you to make an argument that this is what is most important and these are most salient, so I can see, for example, why it's emphasized that all SDGs are in principle relevant for any country. Probably one on equality is less salient, let's say, in Denmark than in Congo. Also, just an example. And if the data allows you to make a statement, look, this is what the natives say about the salience of these 2 goals. They are really pressing. This is 90% of their livelihood that they kind of talk about and are concerned about on a daily basis. Whereas the others, maybe they're not as relevant, which doesn't mean not as relevant doesn't mean they're not relevant.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and I think the other comment I would add is that, of course, with any at least qualitative research, when you're looking at an empirical phenomenon, it's always very complex, and you can always only tell just one story. You cannot tell 5 stories, and you have to convince the reviewers, okay, I looked at these other stories, I know I could tell a story, but this is the story that's really interesting and where we can make a contribution. So you need to kind of convince the reviewers about it in this way. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know if you are aware, but there's a bit of discussion about the nexus of the SDGs. So those SDGs coming together. So that's why I kind of asked the question, maybe you came across a framework also for the analysis through a nexus perspective.
I mean, I personally, I mean, these SDGs are abstract things. I mean, they're useful because they help us to frame problems and they help us to make sense of things, but in the end, they're abstract. So you need to look at what is it in practice? What's the problem for those people? What are they trying to solve? And from that, work upwards to the SDGs. That's the approach that I would take. Yeah.
I'd like to read another question from the chat from Yelena Antokopoulou. Sorry if I didn't read right. She's saying, thank you to all speakers and contributors. I'm wondering, why is it that we have not discussed what impact means? How might we then account impact in relation to grand challenges or other modes of engaged scholarship? The latter has been a topic already explored, but we need to move forward by empirically studying lived experiences of impact through collaborative research especially. Any thoughts?
I agree that impact doesn't, what impact means for one group is not the same that it means for another group. So different audience have different expectations with regard to impact, and also maybe one group like shareholders can have also expect different forms of impact. So I think it's we need to appreciate that there's a diversity of forms that impact can have, and one form can be very helpful for one group and it can be just not relevant for another group. But there's not just like one measure of impact that is relevant for everyone uniformly. So that would be way too narrow. And I think that's important. That, I mean, these 5 forms, for example, that I was going through, this is of course from the perspective of a researcher, right? So if a manager would discuss, if managers or business managers would discuss about impact, probably they would not care about what we say about educational impact. It's very relevant for us as academics, probably not relevant for managers. They want to see the instrumental value of things and practical impact. Maybe they don't care so much about a theoretical contribution, whereas we as scholars, maybe we're intrinsically interested in having a theoretical understanding of why things work the way they work, whereas other people, for them, it's maybe not so relevant to understand the why question. They will just want to see that it works, and that's enough, and that's okay. So I think we need to appreciate the diversity of impact and need to have, and I think this is already in place in many regards, to have a context-sensitive understanding of what is impact. So if you say I'm being impactful, then, well, how you want to be impactful and with respect to whom and about what? I think that these are the questions that need to be asked, and they can have different answers. If that, I'm not sure if that answers your question actually, but.
Yeah, I agree, and maybe just to speak to that, I think with impact, it's more about asking these questions that Christopher just outlined. To whom can I speak? What kind of impact can I, etc. And this is not something that you will. It's good to have these questions at the beginning of your research and keep these in mind as you're going through your research. But you will not have the answer at the beginning, and probably also not in the middle. Maybe towards the end, you find some way where and how you can have impact, but I think it will change throughout your research process. And yeah, as Christopher said, it's something that's context dependent, so it will evolve depending on how your research evolves and the empirical field. Yeah.
Thank you. Sadek, you were raising your hand earlier. Would you like to ask your question again?
No, if there are some other burning question, my one is not, I don't think so important, but I wanted to hear from Katharina, like, because I think she mentioned that she is looking forward to addressing it for next 20 years. So like, my question is, it's kind of informal, like, how do you think, like, you are focusing on the same grand challenges on different facets and like solving it to, how do you like think about it for the next, I can think about for next 1 year, but I want to think through my dissertation, like, okay, I can go forward with this, my dissertation. So how do you think forward it? So that was kind of an informal, probably a silly question also.
Yeah. No, but I think actually it's a good question, because to some extent, I don't know what's going to happen in climate change and financial markets in the next 10 years or the next 20 years. I don't know, but I just think that this long-term commitment to a particular phenomenon can be quite useful for your research. And it's definitely the case that it will not go away, because these are grand challenges. We will grapple with them for a long time, and they will change their form. So now the problem is X, and in 5 years, the problem will morph into Y, and in 10 years, it will morph into Z. And if you have a long-term commitment, at least I think, if you have a long-term commitment, you're able to kind of follow this and kind of shape the field as you go along. And I think with these kinds of topics, you will always have an opportunity to take them somewhere else. I mean, for example, Paula Jazakowski, she started with well, maybe it wasn't a grand challenge to reinsurance industry, but now she's from that big study, she's moved into the insurance gap. I don't remember the exact topic, but so you can move on from one particular empirical phenomenon to another, etc. So yeah.
Thank you. I'm just being cautious of time. Perhaps we can discuss one more question. Jose Mentos is asking in the chat. It's a little bit broad, perhaps. I'm doing qualitative research on informality and informal business in Colombia. I'm new on grand challenges. Any advice on how should I frame my research?
Oh.
I mean, that's a broad question. So I mean, it's so like what I take from this question, not knowing more about your research. I mean, it's already interesting that you study, at least from a European perspective or American perspective. Colombia is a bit of a kind of unconventional setting. So typically, if you say I'm studying a hospital in the UK, let's say, okay, we have read so many studies about hospitals in the UK, we just don't need more. If you say, well, I'm studying informal economy in Colombia, there's, oh, okay, interesting. I've never read about Colombia. So I would just, again, not hide the fact that you have an unconventional setting that, at least for if you want to publish it like in the European or American journals, that's not what people read about every day. And then, not really being an expert on this, I mean, there is a body of literature on the informal economy that you can pick up, and I mean, I would see it as as most qualitative projects go. It's an iterative process between data and theory. So, what is the interesting thing that the data tells you? What do you find surprising in the data? What kind of speaks against your own assumptions about what they would? So maybe you expected from the respondent answer A, but they said B. Maybe that's something to go after. Say, make a code on this. Like, hey, this is interesting. Why did they say B? I expected A. And then go to the literature and say, okay, what do we already know about this phenomenon? Maybe there's like 5,000 studies that point towards B. Maybe then it's not so interesting anymore because it seems we kind of already know that. And then go back and forth between the theory and data. What's in the data that is interesting? What's in the literature that is not yet being described thoroughly, that you can't really contribute to? Then go back to the data, maybe you find something else. And then if you find this unique sweet spot of, okay, this is an interesting aspect in my data, and hey, this has not really been addressed in the literature, that's your sweet spot, so to say, where you can frame a contribution.
Any other final comments from Katarina or Ali? You're muted.
Yeah, I think Ali had to leave. He had to pick up his small son. But no, nothing from my side. Thanks everybody for listening. I find it super exciting that so many people joined and also stayed on, even though we went over time. So I find it very encouraging. Yeah, I wish you all good luck with your research. And if at any point in time you need some additional input, feel free to get in touch. At least for me, that's always fine.
Yeah, I mean, same for me. So thanks to Ibrat and your buddies for organizing this. And I mean, even though we could not meet in person, it does show the benefits of having a virtual setting, because now we could have we had participants from around the world. It seems that if we would have done it in a real life setting, it would be maybe at Cranfield University, somewhere in the middle of the UK where nobody ever was, and we would be 25 people or so. So there's some advantages of having these things online, although as much as probably everyone, I do look forward to come back to some real life interaction. Let's see how that goes. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining in. I hope it was interesting, and see you again somewhere.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Katharina and Ali, and everyone who participated today.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye-bye.